A very good morning to you, our viewers. Hello once again. Welcome to yet another exciting edition of ACFIM Talks. This is a space where we interrogate key issues of national concern, and especially when it comes to democracy and development. My name is Annette Chirabo, and I'll be your host for today. But first, before I delve into today's discussion, if you haven't already subscribed to our YouTube channel, I encourage you to subscribe and share the links for today's show with colleagues so that many can tune in and be part of this discussion. Today's topic, today being the International Human Rights Day, we shall be discussing human rights and democracy in Africa in commemoration of the International Day of Human Rights. But before we delve into the discussions, I'd like to give us some bit of context to this subject. Alliance for Finance Monitoring today joins the rest of the world in commemorating the International Human Rights Day. For those of us out there who are not familiar with this is a day which is celebrated every 10th of December. And on this day in 1948, the United Nations General Assembly adopted what they called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now, this declaration was meant to be a milestone in proclaiming the inalienable rights that everyone is entitled to as a human being, regardless of race, regardless of your culture, regardless of your religion, regardless of your political affiliation, nationality, social origin, and so on and so forth. Today being the International Human Rights Day, the theme for this year is centered around equality, reducing inequalities, and advancing human rights. This day, it comes at a time when the record of our human rights as a nation and a few other African countries, of course, not only here in Uganda, are a subject of scrutiny, especially given the fact that we have had a series of human rights injustices, given the fact that during this COVID period, we've had a number of African countries going to their elections. And so we've witnessed quite a number of uprisings and detestations to the governments in power and so on and so forth. And the way that these uprisings are responded to have been rather appalling. So now, the elephant in the room is COVID-19 pandemic has served to entrench authoritarian characteristics on leaders in many countries. So, given that brief background, today I have I host two gallant human rights activists whom I shall introduce. First, I'll introduce Mr. Edward Serucaca. Edward is the Advocacy Officer of the National Coalition of Human Rights Defenders. He is a lawyer by training with extensive expertise in advocacy, strategic planning, and scrutiny for human rights defenders. And he has previously served at Defend Defenders, which is a regional protection organization for human rights defenders in the region. Edward, you are very welcome to the show. Second, I have Mr. Kainda Eddie. Eddie Kainda is an economist and an expert on key issues to do with the economy. And of course, we cannot discuss issues of human rights in exclusion of the economy. He's also an educationist and a program manager. You're very welcome, Mr. Kainda. Mr. Kind, I think you're muted. I can hardly hear you.
Yeah, I was saying that thank you very much for inviting me to this forum and to this discussion, and I'm happy to make a contribution to this agenda. Thank you.
All right. I will start with you, Mr. Kainda. Being an economist, from the economics perspective, what is your conceptualization of human rights in the African perspective, especially trying to link it with the economy, the dynamics to do with the economy? And probably as you throw light on that, also kindly give us context of human rights, where we are now. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Annette, for this invitation and contributing to this discussion. First of all, for purposes of our viewers, we need to know that today is the International Human Rights Day, 10th of December 2021. And we also understand that the human rights is a very broad subject, and we need to understand what it is and contextualize it in the African perspective. Firstly, we need to know that the theme of today's International Human Rights Day is inequality and advancing human rights. When you're advancing human rights in any perspective, we need to know that we need to kind of understand where is Africa in terms of the inequalities we're talking about. When we talk about inequalities, we're also trying to mean things that make human life very difficult to live in terms of politics, in terms of democracy, in terms of social culture, but also in terms of economic rights, finance, and accountability. Secondly, we need to know that human rights violations or human rights itself should be given a human face. People must understand what is this animal that we call human rights. In the perspective of economics, human rights means a deficiency in the ways and the standards of how a person lives. And I will give it to context in the African perspective. When you talk about gender-based violence, women, men, and girls, a deficiency where men are killed, women are killed, girls are violated. We're talking about human rights violation. When we're talking about issues of extreme poverty, economic exclusion, where persons cannot get what to eat, where a person cannot get what to drink, we're talking about human rights violation. Today I saw a new study that is coming up that is saying that 35% of persons that are living in urban areas in Uganda earn 100,000 shillings. This is about $27 in the US currency. What does that mean in terms of using that $27 to access the basic human rights in terms of education, in terms of health, in terms of food, among others? When we're talking about the access to better health in Africa and the limitations that we do have, I'll give you an example that Africa has contributes about 16.7% of the urban of the world population, but less than 5% of the African population is vaccinated. The developed world is either holding or putting limitations to access to vaccination. Those are violations of human rights. When you talk about issues of our wasted generation, because of inadequate education that we have not had, and the increasing educational poverty, learning poverty, where people cannot read, people cannot write, we're talking about human rights violation. And then I'm trying to give you a human face of human rights. Lastly, when you talk about Africa that goes hungry, when you have abundance of food or capacity to produce food, but we go hungry, We're talking about exclusion of people with disabilities. When you talk about stigmatization of people that are living with HIV, we're talking about securitization of service delivery and securitization of living. When you talk about censorship of the press and media freedoms, we're talking about corruption where the national leaders are protecting the corrupt. Yesterday, the president was saying that, okay, they are corrupt, but they are using the money they're stealing to put up hotels and facilities in Africa. To me, that is violation of human rights. Therefore, we must remove the politicization of human rights in terms of killings, in terms of shootings, to give a face to what human rights is. And if we do that, then we can always give our mother Africa a better conceptualization of the human rights, and then we can always participate in promotion of human rights. Thank you, Annette.
Wow, that is so insightful. Over to you, Edward. Would you weigh in? Would you, from your perspective, being a lawyer, would you also give us, from your perspective, what human rights is? And as you do that, please also comment on the fact that we know that when this declaration, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, was put into play, do you think that an instrument such as this has the comments have a history of flouting human rights? How do we reconcile that? Over to you, Edward. Edward, I think you're muted. Edward, I think you're muted. Kindly unmute. Edward, I can hardly hear you. Kindly unmute. Can you hear me? I can hardly hear you. Would you kindly unmute yourself? Oh, so sorry. Edward, I can hardly hear you. I don't know whether the problem is on my end. All right. I can hardly hear you. Okay. So sorry. I think there's some issue there. As we rectify that, let me come back to you, Eddie Kaida. I'll give you the same. Give us a perspective. You know, when a day like this, there was a declaration that was made, as I was alluding to earlier. Do you think that declarations such as this have the power to really put in check governments, like I mentioned earlier, that have had a chronic history of flouting human rights? Could you kindly weigh in on this? Give us your perspective on this. Yes. Eddie, please unmute yourself. Okay.
Yes, you know, when such kind of declarations are made by governments and states in world over, states ratify to follow the provisions of these ratifications. But within the international political spectrum, there's also what we call sovereignty of a state. Now, I might ratify that I'll do ABC in terms of upholding human rights, but it is within my purview as a sovereign state to select or to choose what I do and what I do not do. You have always seen, and in the African political perspective, that every time the developed world, the US, the EU, come up to put sanctions, for example, against African states, or kind of put African states to check, they are happy and quick to say that we are a sovereign country, and therefore what applies to your country does not apply to us. We have seen in many cases, for example, when we bring this home to Africa, to Uganda, You have had the president, our good president, telling us that you cannot lecture me on issues of democracy. You cannot lecture me on issues of human rights. Meaning that, yes, we do have these ratifications made, but we shall not force a state that is not willing to ratify the provisions to act. That is why the developed world has come up to force and probably put travel sanctions, put financial sanctions, like they have put to some of Uganda's political figures and security figures, among others. But also, when we attended a conference on with the National Coalition for Human Rights Defenders, we also learned that the human rights stakeholders have to persuade, and I'm using persuasion in context, whereas we are lining up issues that affect humans in terms of violating the human rights stand. We need to persuade the national governments to take on the provisions. We're not going to force them. We're not going to coerce them, but they have to use a persuasive language. And the states are also have a party to say we can take on that or we cannot take on that. At the end of the day, these provisions or these ratifications remain a white elephant, remain signed statements without some level of seriousness, without some level of ensuring that the provisions are implemented. That's what I can comment about that, Annette.
All right. You hinted on something interesting where you mentioned that it's on record that our president said that he cannot be lectured on human rights issues. Today, we know that the American President Joe Biden, he hosted a World Summit on Democracy, and 111 countries were invited, of which 17 are African countries. However, from East Africa, we see that it is only Kenya that was invited. So one would wonder, does this have anything to do with the human rights record of the rest of the countries within the region? What do you think?
Annette, I don't want to commit myself on whether Uganda, in the perspective of the US, based on that invitation, is violating human rights or not. But what we need to know, to know is that Biden and the US have had a given criteria that they have used to select probably one of which could be the human rights violations. If you put that into context, that this comes at a time when some of the security top officials have been slapped sanctions, and by the same country, probably could say yes or no. But what I want to tell you is that in the spirit of sovereignty of countries and states, Africa must be able to define its own way in which it must uphold the rights that affect their citizens. Now, the democratic principles, the governance principles, the development principles that might govern a developed state like that America may not be the same principles that may govern an emerging country like Uganda. Many times, we the development experts have come to advise Africa that we must contextualize democracy, we must contextualize development, we must contextualize governance to bring forward the particular or the peculiar interest of Africa. And probably that is seen in a different perspective in the US, in the EU, and other developed countries. And to answer your question, I may not reason that Biden could have done that because Uganda is breaking the international human rights records. But based on the criteria, probably they did not see fit Uganda and Rwanda as nations, and they should participate for their own reasons. I might not be able to tell, Annette. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Edward, are you there? Eddie, those are very insightful issues there. Edward, good to have you.
Colleagues,
yes, now I can
me?
hear you. Yes, I can.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yes, we can hear you now.
Yes, I deeply apologize for the internet upsurge.
It is okay. It is okay.
Yeah.
It is very fine.
Thank you very much, colleagues from ACFIM, for inviting me to this conversation, but importantly for holding this conversation at a time like this, where everyone is hard pressed because of restrictions that arise out of the COVID measures that are curtailing human rights for all. Today is a Human Rights Day, but we must acknowledge that human rights are a daily endeavor. It's not only today that we consider conversations on human rights, but it's an everyday task. Now, to add on what my colleague Ed Kainda has hinted on, I think he has touched on various issues, concerns of enforced disappearances that arose out of the last election. We are in a situation where we are dealing with post-electoral environment human rights issues that remain unaddressed. And it's important that this conversation is happening at the backdrop of, I don't know if I can call them staged prosecution of 2 military soldiers that are alleged to have participated in the November 19th killings. It is a progressive step, but in my view, it is just a drop in the ocean. I think our government must take deliberate efforts to hold accountable for people that violate human rights with impunity. Secondly, there are issues of expression rights. As we speak today, Uganda is experiencing a Facebook blockage. For people to access Facebook to date, they have to use VPN. And you see, Facebook has been a largest driver of information and communication for many young Ugandans, because you understand our dividend for our population, 80% are youth. They are small businesses, their innovation, etc. thrive on social media platforms. So it's absurd. We saw a surge in attacks to journalists during the recently concluded election, and that's absurd. So in my view, I think there is need to have a deeper reflection on human rights in this country and actually walk the talk. I heard you ask a very interesting question to Ed Kainda on why our state and our neighbors were not considered for the Presidential Summit on Democracy by the President of the United States of America. I think it is a lactating imagery of loss of confidence in the two countries to actually enforce human rights, but also to stick global human rights standards. And we must hold our government accountable to the commitments it has made at international level when it comes to human rights. Uganda is a member of the UN and has assented to many treaties at global level. And the issue that remains is actually to domesticate some of these legal instruments. You may also have learned that a couple of military leaders, and specifically the head of CMI, have been sanctioned by the American government. And you see, this is because over the last 1.5 years, we've seen a sharp escalation in torture. And Uganda is a signatory to UN conventions on torture. So Uganda must begin walking the talk in terms of implementation of some of the treaties that it has assented to at global level. Must domesticate these treaties. Then when it comes to your political conversation, ACFIM, I know, does a lot of work on politics and elections. I think There is a huge question of vulgarization of our politics, commercialization of our politics. We must have a conversation and put in place measures to see how funding for politics can be managed, because you see, the preoccupation of actors in elections is how to resource their elections more than issues. Because you see, in the last election, we didn't have a huge conversation on the human rights issues. They didn't come up as part of the agendas of some of the candidates, So it is, for me, a day for reflection, because there's a huge intersection between human rights and democracy. There is no democracy when there is no respect for rights. Thank you.
Wow, those are very insightful. Thank you very much. You've alluded to legal instruments and having a law background. In your view, do you think that we have functional audit mechanisms that can be used, that can check human rights violation within our nation, but also across the continent? But then also we know that in Uganda, Uganda has a number of commissions of inquiry required to look into issues of violations of human rights. What have these commissions done? I want to hear your view on this perspective. Over to you, Edward.
Yeah, thank you very much. First, there is the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. And for me, I believe it just provides a normative framework. And Uganda, for the record, has one of the most progressive constitutions that provide for a clear Chapter 4, which we call the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights has a provision for almost all the fundamental rights. But the challenge that we saw as civil society was the enforcement of those specific rights. And that's why you saw over the last 3 years, our conversation was, how do we make the Bill of Rights or Chapter 4 of the Constitution operational? So civil society engaged in advocacy around what we now call the Human Rights Enforcement Act, such that even an individual can institute a complaint or can prosecute a case that arises out of a human rights violation. There are instruments like the Convention Against Torture, the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights. All those instruments Uganda is a party to. The challenge is really more so on implementation. There is no absence of the law in Uganda. If anything, Uganda has one of the most progressive legal regime in as far as human rights is concerned. The challenge is implementation. The challenge is impunity. The challenge is the state taking a first step in holding its own accountable for violations. You get it? Sure. It surprises many Ugandans when a member of the military forces is sanctioned by a foreign country. You see, the president has appeared on TV condemning a sharp rise in human rights violations, actually condemning torture, in some cases, corruption. You get it? Now, the challenge is for him to actually move ahead of the condemnation, to put the condemnation into action. You see, for me, I believe that the UNRED treaty that we've not really assented to as a country is on the International Convention on Enforced Disappearances. And I think if we had, because I know up to date there are people whose relatives were kidnapped in the last general election, whose people have disappeared, and to date they don't know their whereabouts, but also it becomes impractical to try to push the state to produce these persons in the absence of that specific convention being domesticated. So the challenge for me, large and by, is for a smaller part, the law, but for a bigger part, enforcement, the political will from the leadership of this country. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you very much for that. You've indeed, you've spoken about us, Uganda, being rich in legal instruments. Now, that being said, is it prudent, especially given the fact that the status now, despite the law being present, they are constantly being broken and flouted? Do you think that we should continue renewing commitment to the rule of law? And if so, what other way? What can we do differently? You've been talking about the lack of implementation. What can be done to actually to actually encourage enforcement, in your own opinion? What can be done to put the laws that we have in action? Edward, over to you. Edward, can you hear me?
I'm afraid I'm having difficulty listening to you.
Can you hear me now?
I don't know if Kayinda picked something. If he did, then he could save me.
Eddie, can you hear me? Eddie, you're muted. Would you kindly unmute?
If you're hearing me.
Yes, I can hear you.
Annette was mentioning that what can be done to ensure that some of these provisions are implemented, and to ensure that we can uphold the provisions that countries ratify in Africa, or in Uganda in particular, in terms of promotion of human rights. That's what Annette was mentioning, if I got her correctly.
Thank you very much. I think in terms of advocacy, there are three spaces that are available to human rights defenders like ourselves. The three spaces are the advocacy at national level, using the available advocacy platforms at national level. And in my view, this includes Parliament, working with the Human Rights Committee of Parliament to make sure that legislation that is passed by Parliament is human rights compliant, but also holding government accountable, because the parliamentary committees have power to summon the leaders of the government agencies that oftentimes are behind these human rights violations. But also the other aspect is to use courts. Ever since the passing of the Human Rights Enforcement Act and also the Prohibition of Torture Act, we've seen less prosecution of people that are violating some of these rights. So I think it's important for us to test these laws by actually challenging some of these actions. We've seen some successful prosecution. For example, the torture of Zake, his case was filed by Aaron Kiza under the Anti-Torture Act, and actually courts have held in the favor of Comrade Zake and actually granted him reprieve. Now, at national level, for me, in my view, there is Parliament, there are courts, but also there is the Equal Opportunities Commission and the Uganda Human Rights Commission. The challenge that we've had over the last 2 years is that there is no deliberate effort from the state to operationalize the Uganda Human Rights Commission by way of resourcing, but even by way of constituting it. Now, at regional level, there is the East African Court of Justice. I think human rights defenders working on environment are using it as an avenue to challenge persistent environmental destruction, but also targeted attacks towards environmental human rights defenders. There is also the African Commission for People and on People and Human Rights. It's also a regional platform that is available for us to raise some of these human rights issues. But on a more global level and a grander scale, there is the UN mechanism, which is called the Universal Periodic Review Mechanism, where Uganda has made many commitments in as far as some of these treaties are concerned in terms of domesticating them. So if Uganda is not actually domesticating them, these are issues that we can raise at Uganda's next review. So in my view, there are three levels. The last level would be to protest, to exercise our right to demonstrate and protest. For example, Kayinda, like the MPs from Moroto, can decide to stage a naked protest to see that action is taken where it's not seeing it. I thank you.
Yeah, I'll gladly participate in that.
Thank you very much, Edward. Right about now, we shall go into a commercial break. We shall return after and continue this conversation. Thank you.
So, Madam MP, I'm so honored to have you on this interview. So, for starters, how does it feel like being an MP? I want you to take me through your scope of work in this office.
So you really want me to take you through my day, how I spend my day?
Sure.
Let me start with office. Actually, I think this is something better. Why don't I hand over my office to you for something like 2 or 3 days?
That will be perfect,
It
madam.
will be perfect. So when will you be free?
We can do it now.
Now? I'm going to hand over my office to you for 24 hours.
Okay.
Right. This is a list of the calls I'm expecting today. These are the phones. You make sure you note down everything.
Okay. Have a good day.
Have a good day too.
Yes, please, Officer for MP. Yes. Please, I'll call you back. Hello, Officer of the MP. How may I help you? Yes. Which place is that? Oh my God. How much? 40. My God! Is this what she goes through?
Oh, whatever. Thank God you're back. I can't do this anymore. But we agreed for 24 hours. What does that mean? I don't know how you do it. Let me just look back to you. Have you got enough for your story?
Enough. I got more than what I bargained for. Thank you so much.
Voters redefined the work of an MP. I buy food, I pay for burials, I pay school fees for so many, I pay hospital bills, I buy seeds and donate.
What? Why? Tell people the bitter truth.
They don't want to know.
Do your job.
Which is?
Make laws, protect the democratic government, oversee the implementation of the government programs.
They don't want to.
When will you ever put service before politics?
Tell voters I'm a politician, not a Rotarian. They should stop that begging culture of theirs.
Stop imposing such overwhelming demands on your MP. The statutory role of an MP is to perform legislation, oversight, budget approval, and representation.
Contribute today at www.politicalfinanceafrica.org/donate.
Welcome back, our viewers. Today on ACFIM Talks, we are discussing human rights and democracy, and today being the International Human Rights Day, it's only fit that we have conversations such as this. When we broke off, we were discussing about, the fact that we seem to have the laws, but the issue is around implementation. So I want to bring you in, Eddie, here. Given all that we've discussed, in your view, how have African state institutions upheld human rights? Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Annette. First of all, I will effectively honor Serucaca's invitation to stage a naked demonstration. as long as it can bring rights into Uganda, as long as it can save our mothers that die in labor. In Uganda, we have about 400 out of the 1,000 deliveries dying in labor as we participate, sir. But specifically to your question, you see, in a functional democracy or in a functional state, the state has a critical role in ensuring that democracy and human rights principles are upheld. We shall have a state that ensures that people have access to the basic existential rights and services that they need to survive. But in Africa, generally, we have had a challenge of separation of powers. When you look at the bloodlines between the executive, the judiciary, and the parliament, and the usurping of powers by different state institutions against the others, it makes the whole role of the state to uphold human rights vague. When you hear the president, I gave this as an example when I was starting the show, that the president coming up in a national at a national event to say that it is okay for people to be corrupt as long as they invest the resources they have stolen and built up hotels and skyscrapers. Now you wonder whether the president has the goodwill to ensure that we can uphold the right to be financially inclusive, the right to enjoy a state where we have no corruption does not exist. Secondly, when you look at the performance of state institutions, give me an example of one functional state institution in our country in Uganda. Give me one example of a functional state institution in Africa, other than the military that we do have. In Egypt, in South Africa, in Uganda, we have shown our military pros to go and attack the ADF rebels in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is an okay thing. But as we lift our jets to go and fight, what are our children feeding on? What are our mothers? How are our mothers delivering? How is the state of corruption in our country? You know, we have a right to protect ourselves, and I support the UPDF, for example. But we have so much that is at our disposal to ensure that as a state, we uphold the functional and existential rights of Ugandans and Africans to be better Africans. But thirdly, when you took in the Ugandan context, when you look at the Uganda Human Rights Commission, a commission that is supposed to manage, to monitor the prevalence of human rights, that is supposed to put government to check to ensure that human rights are not violated. What is her role in ensuring that Ugandans are not murdered? Ugandans are not. There's no crime. Ugandans and girls are not maimed. Girls are not impregnated at early ages. Girls are not married at early ages. You know, it is more of a white elephant lying in limbo and not doing anything to protect the rights of Ugandans. And I want to imagine that this is the same kind of story in other African nations. When you look at prioritization of expenditure in the context of Africa, politics has stood out as one of the areas of expenditure where most African countries are spending on. But you know that we are living in a political economy. Look at 2021 elections that we had in Uganda. Uganda presided over the most expensive election in Africa, where almost every person that stood and won an electoral seat, other than in central Uganda, almost bought his way to the political apex. A country where corruption is seated at the deep roots of the state. You cannot expect that such a state in Africa and in Uganda in particular can have the goodwill to fight corruption, but also to promote the rights of people. A state where you have 50% of the budget that is stolen. The IGG report recently was mentioning that almost 2.6 trillion Ugandan shillings is stolen, is lost in corruption annually. And you know that Uganda's budget is 40 trillion and 50% of it is lost in corruption. But the president is coming up to tell us, look, they are stealing it but investing it in our country. Honestly, sometimes I lack the right words to describe. But I want to submit that if the state had the knowledge wherewithal, the technical wherewithal, the financial muscle that they do have, they would have ensured that we can promote human rights, both politically and from the socio-economic perspective. Back to you, Annette.
Thank you so much, Eddie Kainda. Speaking of state institutions, we've witnessed most recently, not only in Uganda, but across the continent, or rather across the globe, that civic space has continuously shrunk, especially now let me bring it home here in Uganda. When it comes to civil society, especially organizations that seem to be a little critical on holding government accountable to their actions. What can we do to sort of like push back against such actions as these of the shrinking civic space? And then also, what is the role of civil society when it comes to upholding and encouraging and enforcing human rights? Over to you.
Thank you, Annette, for that interesting question. But first of all, I have learned that in Africa, a party that comes out to defy the position of the state is an enemy to the state. And in this context, civil society has been regarded defiant, irrespective of the enormous contribution civil society is providing to states in Africa. When you look at countries where there is war, in the Maghreb region, in Southern Sudan, in Khartoum, Sudan, in the DRC, in Ethiopia right now, where the Tigray are fighting against the mainstream government, the opposing parties have been labeled to be supported by the civil society. You recall that even here in Uganda, during the 2021 elections, civil society was labeled to be a conduit for supporting the opposition politicians in the Ugandan political arena. Of course, which wasn't the case. Or if it was there, it was minimal. But a situation where the government or the states cannot identify a collaborative structure to work with each other, we are always going to find it a problem to have a meaningful contribution from the non-state institutions, including the civil society. But to be specific, civil society has a role to play in ensuring that we do provide knowledge, promote human rights, but also preserve human rights. The issue is whether the the civil society institutions are also upright in this case. We have had cases where we have always found that the challenges that are happening in some of the state institutions are also crippling some of the civil society organizations. But generally, civil society is supposed to promote, preserve, and provide information about the emergence and giving human rights a face. One of the reasons why we have not upheld, like I mentioned at the beginning, we have not upheld human rights is because we have not gotten to understand the actual meaning of human rights. Secondly, civil society must play the role of being an influencer, the role of a lobbyist, ensuring that we bring government or states to book, ensuring that some of the key issues that are being raised, like I mentioned at the beginning, the education, the health, the mothers, the gender violence is brought to the face of people so that they can get to know that actually the situation is getting out of hand and we must have a role to play as government. Fourthly, civil society organizations provide direct assistance. Some of us are in schools, others are in health services, others are in food security, among others. We must ensure that we participate in direct provisioning of social services to ensure that we uphold the rights of people, but also to try to help eliminate social problems, for example, health issues where we can, the stigma against people living with HIV, the stigma against persons that are battered in their homes, the stigma that the husbands are beaten by the wives. You know, these are some of the issues that we should be bringing up. And lastly, civil society must act as a bridge between government and the local people. You know, there has been a very huge disconnect between government and the local people. To me, in Africa, what African states are doing, what African governments are doing, are not in connect with what the local person needs. Whereas you are lifting planes to go and fight, we need food. Whereas you're building mansions like the president is mentioning, we need hospitals. Whereas you are commercializing politics, we need digital learning and remote learning for our UPE children that are not going to school for the last 2 years. Schools are opening right now in the next 1 month, but parents are already claiming that they don't have money to take children to school. You know, these are the issues that civil society should be working on and acting as a bridge between itself and the government, ensure that people can live better lives and have universal rights that promote the dignity and existence of the human race in Africa. Back to you, Annette.
Wow, thank you, Eddie, for those. Edward, do you want to chip in on the same?
Yeah, and I thank you for being really patient with me despite the internet challenges. I know for a fact that the cost of internet in this country is very high, and that is also a human rights concern. But also increasingly, climate change and environmental rights are a concern. One thing that I know for a fact that needs to be done is for civil society to be embraced as a partner, not an adversary. If you noticed, one of our biggest funders, the Democratic Governance Facility, has been suspended for quite some time now. It is actually under what we would call indefinite suspension. So it's at the mercy of the state, but the continued suspension affects the operationalization of most NGOs in this country. And what does that mean? It means that the communities whose back these organizations hold are also increasingly affected. I'll give you an example. There's been a huge spike in teenage pregnancies across the country. Organizations that work to end that vice are challenged in terms of resources to be able to facilitate their community monitors to go and follow up those cases, to actually report to the police stations. So there is a need for financing of NGOs, and if it cannot be local, the government must be open to support NGOs to actually get the financing from external sources. Therefore, regionalization of funding of NGOs should be a conversation that is not one-sided, but brings civil society and the state on one table. That's critical. Two, the space of NGOs has increasingly shrunk because NGOs are not seen as allies. They are called economic saboteurs, they are called political opponents, etc. NGOs or NGO work should be seen for what it is. There are NGOs increasingly over the last 20 years that have made a big contribution to this country. I'll give you an example. There are NGOs that work in northern Uganda that have been working to ensure that victims of the war get all the requisite support. There are many NGOs that have been answering the transitional question in northern Uganda, but most recently, even in Rwenzori, where we witnessed killings of people in November 2016. Those NGOs are helping the government. So I don't know why the government sees them as adversaries. So it's important for the role of the NGO, the place of the NGO to be situated in the structure of governance of this country. And if there is no political will to provide this space, then NGOs are left with no option but to utilize means as courts, petition, global human rights mechanisms like the African Commissioner talked about, and the UN. For example, Uganda is going for its third review. The UPR mechanism that is at the UN, it's a peer-to-peer review of states' records on commitments they've made on human rights. Uganda will be reviewed in January. Now, that's an opportunity for civil society to engage on the assessment of the state's implementation of global commitments on human rights. But also, it's an opportunity to enter into advocacy on the new emerging issues that civil society thinks the government of Uganda must prioritize in the next 4 years. So there are avenues through which civil society can engage, notwithstanding the existing structural challenges. Finally, courts are an avenue, but our courts should be aware of the context in which civil society operates. We are aware that courts have a challenge. There are structural and systematic challenges for people to access justice. So it is up to civil society to also heighten their advocacy to see that those structural bottlenecks within the court and judicial system are rectified. I am really I don't know. The state is moving to amend the bail provision in our law book. That bail provision is inherent and it is as good as it is. Rather than spend resources on amending a good law, those resources should be dedicated to the structural problems in the judiciary. More judges, more magistrates, digitalization of courts. I was following the Segedin and Sewanyana case. Court was held for 2 hours because the connectivity at Chitaria and Chigo, where each of them was held, was not syncing with the main court where the matter was being heard. So there are structural issues that must be resolved before we start annihilating a good law. So I thank you for giving us this opportunity to have this conversation. I believe it will continue because it provides us an opportunity to also have a discourse with those out there that are listening to this wonderful ACFIM talk.
Wow, those are very, very insightful issues. The conversation is really interesting, but our time is really fast spent. We are actually left with 1 minute. But in this 1 minute, would you give us your conclusive remarks? I'll actually start with you, Edward. Give us your conclusive remarks. What should we take home at the end of it all? Over to you.
I thought you'd give me a breather.
Oh.
Yeah, but one is to encourage the citizens that there is hope and human rights is a daily endeavor. It's not today that we discuss it, but also to work with each other to push the agenda of inclusiveness, because this year's theme is on fighting exclusive inequality. Therefore, we must do our work and be mindful of issues of equity and equality. But also advocacy sometimes is painstakingly slow, but it eventually yields results. So we must continue monitoring, documenting and reporting on rights issues. But also it's important for us to have such discussion when they are evidence-based. So let's not give up, and I wish all of us a good Human Rights Day. Thank you.
Thank you. Eddie, over to you. Give us your conclusive remarks.
Annette, it's going to take you and I and Edward and people who are listening and tuning into this show to ensure that we save our mother Africa. We cry for our mother Africa to ensure that Africa is a better place. When we do a comparison of how other continents are living and we look at Africa, we always shed our tears and say, why we? It's not a mistake that is God is giving us another day to survive. During the pandemic, if what happened in Europe happened in Africa, Africa would be doomed. But that all points to lack of prioritization in terms of the basic existential rights that we need to enjoy as Africa, but also the lack of prioritization in terms of expenditure, in terms of economic issues that do affect you and I. If we combine effort and civil society is looked at as a partner in the development of human rights with government and other stakeholders, including the media, we think we can educate the masses in Africa to make Africa a better place like it had always been. I thank you very much, Annette.
Wow. Thank you very much, our gallant viewers. And we would like to continue conversation as this, and we would like to encourage each and every one of us. This is a conversation that is not exclusive it's not exclusive to the government or to particular sects of people, but it's a conversation that all of us should be having and all of us should be part of. And so I encourage that each of us should continue fighting for rights as this, coming out if you feel your rights are not being upheld. I will end like this with a quote from Eleanor Roosevelt, and it says, "Where, after all, do universal human rights begin? In small places, close to home, so close and so small that they cannot be seen on any maps of the world. Unless these rights having meaning there, they have little meaning anywhere. Without concerted citizen action to uphold them close to home, we shall look in vain for progress in the larger world." I remain Annette Chirabo. I've been your host for today. Thank you so much for joining us. Until next time, bye-bye.
Thank you, Annette.